What's going on, everybody? Welcome to this recorded Lumix Live session. If you've been following for the last little bit, you know that we are on the road for the last 2 weeks. So this is the last of the sessions when we're not in the Lumix Live studio. So clearly, very different environment. But we wanted to take this week to actually talk about the recently announced GH6 SSD firmware update that was announced on the 20th. So we're going to go over the installation process for the actual firmware, because it is a slightly different process than we've done in the past for pretty much every camera that we've ever released. So we're going to go through that, but we are also going to go through the actual camera menus and walk through what you need to do, what you should be aware of for settings and how you're going to operate it. And then we'll also touch on the actual verified list of SSDs that are currently validated for performance with the camera. Now, like always, with these, we always do have a verified list, and these are the drives that we have validated in-house. We've tested them against the different recording options, varying different environments that they're tested with. So these are the drives that we can tell you we've tested, we've verified, we know that they work, and barring some sort of manufacturer issue from the drive itself, you should be perfectly fine. So we do have that list. We will put a link in the description for that as well. But yeah, so let's start this whole thing out and actually go over the installation process from the video I recorded before I left. The new firmware update is going to be available shortly for the GH6 that enables SSD recording for both photos and video. So for this process, we're going to walk through the installation and what you need to do to get the camera prepped for this update. Now, to start with, this process is going to be a little different than our normal updating process, so make sure to follow these steps as closely as you can to ensure that everything works out and that both files are installed on the card so that the camera can run through the process. So to start with, you're going to need a CF Express or an SD card. Either is going to work fine, but you're going to want to make sure that those cards are actually set up and formatted in camera before you move to the process of actually putting the files onto the card. So we're going to take a look at my GH6 here, which I have. I'm going to plug in my CF Express card. And to start with, you want to make sure that the card is recognized by the camera, and you can get a good indication of that by seeing a frame count or a photo count on the bottom right, as well as a non-flashing icon on the bottom to indicate that that card is installed. Once the card's installed, we're going to go into the menu. And then we're going to go to the wrench icon and then go to the card and file submenu. From here, you're going to go to card format, click on whichever card you've got installed. I have CF Express installed here, so I'm going to click CF Express. And then you're going to format that card in camera. Now, typically with CF Express cards, I almost always do a low-level format. It takes a little bit longer, but it makes sure that the file structure is going to be set properly for this camera. So let's do that now. Now that the card is formatted, you can eject the card from the camera. Typically for this process, make sure that your camera is turned off and then remove the card once the lights have stopped blinking. This is a good way to ensure that there's no activity being written to the card for any reason whatsoever. Now, once you have the card, you're going to take this and insert it into either a CF Express or an SD card reader, which you can get commercially available from different manufacturers. I recommend doing it this way as opposed to connecting the camera over USB to your actual camera into the computer, mainly because when you do it this way, you make sure that you don't have any kind of issue with the cabling that you're using to connect it into the computer. So from here, we're going to take a look at the files that I've downloaded. So the GH6 firmware update for SSD is going to include 2 separate files that you'll need to have on the CF Express card or the SD card in the root folder. Now, both of these files will be required, and you'll need to have them both installed at the same time. You're going to have file v21, which is version 2.1, and then you'll have another file that's called vv22, which is the version 2.2 update. Now, again, I need to stress this enough. You need to have both of these files installed onto the card at the same time. This is where it's different than our normal traditional updating process. So from here, I'm going to copy and paste both of these files onto my card. Now, It's common practice for people to drag and drop onto your media card for these files. However, I do not recommend that. When you do that, you may not actually be copying the files until you forcibly eject the card from the computer's OS. Doing a copy and paste is a more reliable way to do this, but ultimately make sure that you are still actually going into the file, right-clicking or command-clicking if you're on Apple, or dragging and dropping to the trash can to make sure that you are actually ejecting the media from the computer. So from here, I'm going to click eject. We'll wait a moment. That card is now ejected. And what that means is I can take this CF Express card that I'm using and I can now insert it back into my GH6. Now for this, once you have the card reinstalled into your camera, again, we're going to wait for it to be recognized by the camera. I have my frame counter there. I have the icon for CF Express no longer blinking. Now from here, just click Menu. We're going to go back into that Settings menu, and then we're going to scroll down to the wrench with the 3 dots underneath, and then you'll go into that submenu and go down to Firmware Version. Now from here, click the Menu Set button. You'll have the option for Firmware Update. I'm going to click Firmware Update from here. And then momentarily, you'll see it will come up and say Firmware Update for the body has been detected, version up to 2.1. From here, you're going to click Yes. Now, a few things to make sure that you are very aware of with this update. Like one, we had already stated that this is going to be 2 files that have to be installed on the camera, and it will do this automatically. So this process is going to take relatively longer than our normal updating process, somewhere in the range of 15 to 35 minutes. So make sure that the time that you're going to have spent to do this update, you've got enough time to just leave the camera alone, let the firmware update run, and then come back to it after it's completely done and installed. Now 2, because this is 2 separate files, the camera will reboot a few times, so don't worry that you see the process taking 1 longer than normal, but also that the camera is going to cycle its power a few times as it runs through this update. Those are all normal things to be expecting. So with this update, once you're all done, we'll come back and we'll actually talk about in a separate video what this new update provides. All right, so as you can see, there's a little bit of a difference in the process for actually installing the firmware. It is going to take longer than the normal updates that we've done in the past. So just give yourself enough time, be a little kind of patient with the process. The camera will restart, and as we said, you want to make sure that you just leave the camera alone, let it do its update, and then you'll be perfectly fine. You'll be able to just start recording with the SSDs right after that. But once it's installed, let's actually take a look at my GH6 menu and go through, where do you actually find the SSD option to turn it on, some of the best practices that you should probably be, kind of making sure you take into account when you're working with an external storage device. Basics of how you make sure that you don't cause anything that could potentially cause you to lose footage through either improperly ejecting the drive itself, improper removal of the drive, stuff like that. There is a little bit more to be aware of when you're working with an external device storage, so we're going to use this opportunity to make sure we make it clear our recommended process for actually going through it. We will also talk about the actual SSDs, so we'll do that before we jump into the camera. So there are currently 2 brands of SSDs that have been validated and tested within our specifications for the GH6. One of those is probably the most common one that everyone's been aware of for quite some time, and that is the Samsung T5 drives. They are available in capacities of 500 gigabytes, 1 terabyte, and then up to 2 terabyte. Those drives, like I said, they're probably the most common that everyone's used to kind of seeing out there, used in our particular field. And again, they're relatively inexpensive. They are getting harder to find right now, so we made sure that we had a few other options that that you can pick up in mass market, you can pick up in photo specialties, you can pick up in a vast majority of places if you need high capacity storage, and that's the options from SanDisk. Now there are 2 versions. There's the E81 and E61. Easiest way to tell the difference between these 2 is the E81, the USB-C port is in the middle middle of the drive, where the E61 is on the side of the drive. Really the big difference there, E81s are newer, they're faster, they're the current generations of it. And the easiest thing to do, if you go online, it's the last 3 digits of the part number for those different drives. So you just look up E81 or Samsung SSD drive. They are the rugged drives. So you know that you're going to get a device that's matched to how rugged the Lumix cameras are as well. Those drives are going to come in at 1 terabyte and 2 terabyte for the E81s. The E61s, you were able to find 500 gig, 1 terabyte and 2 terabyte options out there. Though, like I said, the E61s are starting to get harder to come by, just like the Samsung T5 drives. So the E81s are the most current options available out there. There will be more drives that are going to be added to the list for verification. So be sure to keep updated on the list that we have online. That will get you the most up-to-date information as we go through our testing. We add more drives to this. SSD storage or any kind of external storage is definitely much more complex than it is for traditional SD CF Express media that a lot of cameras have been using. So while we are saying that we have our validated media, these are the ones that we know these work, we've tested them, they've gone through our process of doing this. That does not necessarily mean that if you throw a drive that's not on that list that it's just not going to work. But what it means is that you are bearing the risk at that point that we have not validated it. So there's no real guarantee that those devices are actually keeping up to the specifications that are required for, constant data speeds, things like that. So if you choose to use a device outside of what is verified on our list, the risk is all basically up to you at that point. But know that you have options that are available that we have verified, that we know and have tested that work with the GH6 for the SSDs. And I have run both of the SanDisk and the Samsung drives continuously at the 1.9 gigabit in 5.7K, and they've just run flawlessly. So now that we've kind of covered that, let's actually jump into my GH6 and talk about the options. Where do you actually turn this on? And then, we'll go from there. All right, so we're looking at the GH6 actual menu in the camera view now. So we're going to walk through a couple of things to make sure of when you first get the camera turned on after the firmware update. So one of the first things that I suggest everyone does is make sure that you go into your settings menu, check the firmware version, make sure that it shows up as version 2.2, and once you see that, you're good to go to the next steps. So from here, if you want to actually access the SSD options on the camera, you'll see that the option is actually going to be found here in the card and file menu system under the settings option. Now, I have this turned on already, but this is a toggleable option. So if I go to turn this off, you'll see that the camera is going to give me a please wait icon as it changes the system around, and then it looks at the internal storage there, so CF Express and SD cards. Now on the bottom, traditionally, you'll see a 1 and a 2. This is what's going to indicate whether or not you've got a card in slot 1 and slot 2, or just in one or the other. In this case, I only have a CF Express card installed. And you also get your counter on the bottom right there as to how much storage you can actually record on that media. But if I go in here and I turn on SSD recording, again, it's going to take a second. It's going to do please wait, make sure that it's changing that system over to read the SSD that I have attached. You'll see that now you just see the SSD icon on the bottom, and then you see the available recording time, which in this case at 5.7K ProRes 422HQ, so this is the 1.9 gigabit per second, I get an hour and 9 minutes of recording on this particular external SSD. So a couple things to actually keep in mind here. So one, you've got your SSD formatting, so it changes. It is now set up just for SSDs. The other thing here is that your double card slot function is no longer available while you're using SSDs. The amount of processing and the data pipeline is changed now to the external SSD recording, so backup recording and relay recording is not available while using SSD recording. If you do need backup and relay recording internally on the system, you will need to be using CF Express and SD media for that particular style of shooting. You do still have the video file naming formatting here, so I do typically have my GH6 set up as the Cine file naming structure, so you do still have all of that functionality available. Where this differs a little bit is when you go into the different recording options here. So like I said, I have my camera set up right now as ProRes, and you'll see that the ProRes options in basically everything over the full HD options, so the Cine 4K all the way up to 5.7K, is going to be recordable either to a CF Express alone or an SSD. So it's one or the other in these options. So obviously SSD is going to give you much larger capacities to work with than CF Express, especially if you're counting dollar per gig. SSDs are going to be way more cost effective to work with. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Your full HD options, however, those can be recorded on any of the devices. So if you're going to be using CF Express or SD, you can record on either of the internal options that are available, or you can be also just recording to the external SSD should you choose. Now where this changes is if I go and I change my camera into the MOV format. So now you'll see that I am in the MOV recording format. Now, when you are having the camera set up as an SSD recording option, so external out to the SSD, there are a couple things that the camera is capable of doing and some things that the camera is capable of or not capable of doing compared to using internal media storage. The first of those is that with SSD recording, you can only record up to the 60 frames per second options that the camera offers. So everything up to Cine 4K 60 frames per second, even up into the actual 5.8K open gate options at 24 and 30 frames per second, those can all be recorded and stored to the SSD. If you need to record the 4K 120 option, the Cinema 4K 120 option, or the Full HD 240 options, this is where you will need to revert back to using the CF Express or the SD card media. These particular frame rates, anything over 60 frames per second, it is just a system limitation of the throughput and the processing to be able to do those frame rates and the data throughput while also being able to go out to an SSD. So if you do need those, you want to go back to using CF Express and SD cards for those particular choices. But outside of that, the SSD option is going to be great for anything that's in your more kind of standardized frame rates, especially for things where you may be needing to do really long run recording, like an interview or a conversation like we do for Lumix Live. So just keep that in mind in the different options that you're taking a look at here. The other thing to be aware of here is the actual process of going through, and if I want to change my drive, or say in this case I have a 1 terabyte SSD plugged into the camera. Well, if I have larger drives, and if you've read the press release or you've taken a look at the drives that we've kind of verified already, everything is verified up to 2 terabytes. What that means is that anything over 2 terabytes at this point is not validated to work with the camera, and you do get a notification if you do try to use those drives. So what we're going to do now is I'm going to actually change my drive out, and I'm going to show you what this looks like if you put a drive in that is larger than 2 terabytes in capacity. So to do this, you want to make sure that whenever you are changing an SSD drive, it's fairly similar to most computer operations with external hard drives, is I recommend either going into the menus and turning USB SSD off, or powering the camera down, then taking the SSD out, and then coming back in and changing the drive states. For this case, this demonstration, I'm going to show you probably the way that more often people are going to use this, which is just going into the menu and turning SSD recording off. So right now, we're turning the SSD recording off. You get that notice that says, hey, please wait. Now I have a verification that says that it's back into the internal media, and I have that it's the CF Express and the SD card there. So right now, I'm going to swap this out for a 4 terabyte SSD, and we're going to show you what you will see when you actually turn this on with a much higher capacity SSD at this time. So I'll go in, I'll turn USB SSD, and I will turn this on, It's going to give me that please wait as it validates and looks at the card and the size and everything that's available. And as you can see here, if you were using over 2 terabytes, you're going to get this message. It says this USB SSD exceeds 2 terabytes and cannot be used. So keep that in mind when you're looking and shopping for SSDs for this. Our validated SSDs are only up to 2 terabytes because we know that this is a validation for properly working with it. And one of the reasons why we give you a validated list here is so that you don't go out there and get a 4 terabyte drive and then get faced with this particular notice. So just keep that in mind. One little difference there, obviously, as more drives become validated and more options become available, we will always keep you updated if this particular capacity difference changes over time. So with that, let's kind of recap what we've talked about. All right, so the recap, right? SSD recording, it's a huge new addition to the LUMIX cameras, particularly to the GH6. This is going to give you a ton of flexibility if you're someone that's shooting up to 60 frames per second footage and you want to be able to prioritize and use those internal ProRes options for the flexibility that those particular modes give you. The drives that you want to make sure you're keeping attention to are the Samsung T5, 500, 1 terabyte and 2 terabyte, the SanDisk E61, 500, 1 terabyte and 2 terabyte, or the E81 at 1 terabyte and 2 terabyte. Those are the current drives that have been validated for use with the GH6. When it comes to frame rates, up to 60 frames per second is going to be able to be used for the SSD recording out over, well, USB. And when you want to use these particular options, you are going to be using just the external SSD. If you are someone who does utilize in-camera dual recording and backup recording, this is where you will switch back to the internal modes for CF Express and SD media. So across the board, this is a big shift. Being able to now take a mirrorless design camera and be able to adapt and use SSD recording where it's applicable for your particular style shooting is a really nice big advantage for this. Now, more validated SSDs will be coming over time as we continue our testing with those drives. So make sure to keep your ear to the ground, follow us on all the different platforms, and we'll keep you updated as those drives are validated and added to the list online. So with that, thank you everybody for tuning in. If you have questions, drop them in the comments after this video. We'll work hard to get them answered next week when we are actually back live. That goes for all the questions from the last 2 weeks. Again, we will be back live next Thursday at 2 p.m. We are going to be back in the LUMIX Live studio, so traveling will be done for quite a while. And we're going to be interviewing Caleb Hoover for a session during there. So it'll be a bit of a twofer with that stream. An interview with YouTube creator and filmmaker Caleb Hoover, as well as a general AMA and a follow-up of all the questions we've gotten since last week and this week. So you don't want to miss it. Again, thank you everybody for tuning in. If you found this information useful and you feel that we've deserved a like or a subscribe, I would greatly appreciate it. It helps me grow this channel and provide more content to everybody as we keep this whole thing moving forward. Outside of that, hope everyone stays well and you get out there and create some cool stuff.